Hello, welcome to Straightforward. With its assaults across central and northern Iraq in the past 1.5 weeks, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, has taken over from Al-Qa'ida organization founded by Osama bin Laden as the most powerful and effective extreme jihadi and terrorist group in the world. This very ISIS had an outspread in Syria over a year ago, long before the world powers admitted its serious threat to the national security. In Britain, the Prime Minister told MPs that it was wrong to think the crisis in Iraq was nothing to do with the UK, adding that people in a possible ISIS regime are planning to attack the United Kingdom. Let me welcome our guest at the studio first, Mr. Zaid Alisa, expert and writer on human rights activist and democracy advocate, and Mr. Christopher Coverdale British Lawyer and anti-war campaigner. Before we start our discussion today, let's see what the ISIS stands for in this brief report.
The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, known as the ISIS, are Sunni militants who want to establish an Islamic State across the region. While its exact size is unclear, the group is thought to include thousands of fighters. The ISIS are known for their ruthless violence and brutal methods of killing, including mass executions. Last week, militants from the group posted pictures on Twitter claiming that they had killed 1,700 soldiers. Fighters from the militant group have rapidly advanced through mostly Sunni areas of Iraq in recent days, seizing control of several cities including Mosul, Tal Afar and Tikrit, with Iraq's capital Baghdad as their next mission. The group's advances have led to Iran mobilizing its troops on the border with Iraq, and Turkey called for an emergency NATO meeting which was held at the ambassadorial level. Turkey has also threatened to intervene if its 48 citizens held by ISIS in Mosul are harmed. In an effort to curb the violence, the United States has said it is willing to work with Iraq's neighbor and longtime foe, Iran. The Obama administration has already ordered the urgent deployment of 275 armed troops in and around Iraq, and has also signaled it could launch airstrikes. Meanwhile, this week, British Foreign Secretary William Hague said Britain has ruled out the possibility of any military intervention. However, it may give other forms of support to the Iraqi government.
Zaid Alisa, the ISIS has been known for a while in the region, be it in Syria or Iraq. How did things go out of control only just now?
Well, I mean, there are a number of factors. One of the main factors that have led to the sudden lightning advance into Iraq is basically the success of two elections, one that took place in Syria and the re-election of Bashar al-Assad against the will of some major forces in the region, that is Saudi Arabia and Qatar. We also have seen the success against all the odds of the Iraqi elections. A lot of regional powers were counting that there is no way that the Iraqi election, considering the dramatic surge in deadly violence, can take place. It actually took place. And to basically make matters worse for those regional powers, their arch foe, that is Prime Minister Al-Maliki, have actually won a commanding seismic lead against, again, all the expectations. And he was, this success or a victory have paved the way for the state of the law, that is the political bloc that he leads, to actually to grow bigger. So that is another reason. But I mean, all in all, we've seen again a major seismic shift from beginning of 2012 to the end of 2012. There was a major emphasis and of this strategy, which is spearheaded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to actually push and press for a regime change in Syria. That's why we've seen the arming, the funding, logistical support, and actually even paying salaries, which was confirmed by The Guardian, going to all sorts of Wahhabi Salafi mercenaries converging on Syria. Now, with the spectacular failure of actually toppling the regime in Syria, the leadership in Saudi Arabia have actually moved to have a wider strategy of encompassing and involving Iraq, believing that the major backer, or it is the Iraqi, let's say, authorities which are giving a lifeline to the Syrian regime. So by shifting the emphasis to destabilizing Iraq, weakening Iraq, staring own internal problems in Iraq, so that the Iraqi government is preoccupied with dealing with its internal problems. That is, again, one of the factors that led to the dramatic surge in the ability of Al-Qa'ida. And on top of that, as I mentioned, we have basically evidence that have emerged, which is backed up not just by the New York Times, that has clearly said that all the arming and logistical support and the funding has clearly went to the most extremist groups, that is Al-Nusra Front. But more importantly, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of Al-Qa'ida Iraq, has emphasized last April when he said, look, Al-Nusra Front is simply an extension of Al-Qa'ida in Iraq, and its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, is one of our foot soldiers. But more significantly, all those resources have been shared between the Nusra Front and Al-Qa'ida in Iraq, thereby explaining the dramatic surge in the power, influence and prowess of both the Al-Qa'ida in Iraq, which is named ISIS, and also the Nusra Front. Well, one other aspect, another factor is actually, if you see, in tandem with all this, we had also what we call the protests, which erupted also at the end of 2012 in order to pave the way and set the stage. Those protests using the violently sectarian antagonistic rhetoric in order to serve as a major recruitment sergeant for Al-Qa'ida, to serve as to further reinforce the radicalization and also reactivate what we call the safe havens and sanctuaries. All those factors played into the dramatic surge in the power of ISIS.
Now that Mr. Alisa has mentioned arming, on his side he mentioned arming the ISIS, let's talk a little bit about arming the Iraqi army. Chris Coverdale, why do you think the US opted not to allow the Iraqi army to elaborate or maybe to acquire arms that are needed for similar situations like that they are facing today?
Yes, it's a difficult question in a way, but I think really the underlying issue is that they don't want to just turn the country into civil war, and the possibility, the more arms you put into the situation, the more likelihood there is of different groups springing up, feeling they've got the power with the arms to do what they want to do in their local area, and it causes civil unrest all the way through the country. So I personally believe that this is why there is an immediate reaction with the troops not wanting to fight their own countrymen, and it led to this problem of not fighting.
Zaid Alisa, according to Gunter Mayer of Mainz University in Germany, the command structure is a key weakness where the officers' ranks are often awarded to friends who have little or no military competence. He's talking, of course, about under Al-Maliki's government. Would you agree with Professor Mayer on this occasion?
Well, I do believe it could be one of the factors, but it's definitely not one of the major factors. But to pick up on the answer why the Americans have adamantly and defiantly refused to arm the Iraqi army, I do believe that it's a deliberate ploy by the Americans to make sure that they regain their influence in Iraq, which basically after the 2011, and if I go back a little bit, Obama actually had a major change of heart about withdrawing the American forces as the date approached for the agreement to withdraw the forces. He wanted to leave 5,000 to 10,000 forces, but because the Iraqi government, let's say, stood firm, headed by Maliki, he stood his ground and refused, and to add on top of that, there was no way that the parliament would pass a law giving those forces immunity from persecution. That was the requirement, and therefore the Americans had to withdraw their forces. And in order for the Americans to make sure that the Iraqi government will desperately need them and to regain their influence, that's why they were hell-bent on and steadfastly determined not to provide Iraq with the arms. We're talking here about the army, not militias, the same army that actually have been trained by the Americans. They deprived it and they denied it the sort of the means to protect itself, and also the Air Force, because they wanted to use it as a card to actually regain their influence there and to make sure that the Iraqi government headed by Maliki is taught a lesson never to repeat again, that they cannot do it on their own and they have to rely on these Americans.
And now we are joined via Skype by British political activist and blogger David Lowley. Thank you very much for joining the show.
Good afternoon.
David, you mentioned in a blog that what is happening today in Iraq is undoubtedly a direct result of US and British invasion of Iraq in 2003. Tell us more, why do you believe so?
Well, when you look back into just a year later, 2004, there was a massive, great big battle in Fallujah, which is the Sunni part of town over in Anbar province, and where the Americans and so on killed about 4,000 Sunni civilians, and some of them very innocent ones. And not only did that, but they also, using the depleted uranium, affected their drinking water, whereby many children are still being born deformed because of those chemicals the Americans used at the time. So the amount of hatred for the Americans in the western half of Iraq is enormous because of that battle. Another factor was the fact that Saddam Hussein opened up, just before he ran away, as the Americans got there, he opened up all the jails, and many of the Al-Qa'ida followers and so on were released, as they have been over the past 10 years in lots of other jailbreaks. And some of them sprung from that battle in Fallujah as well, and then joined and swelled the forces of Al-Qa'ida on the Sunni side of town. Sorry, do you want to come in? Yes.
David, on the other hand, you write that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has failed to see the obvious antagonistic approach of not inviting the Sunnis to be a part of his administration. How could you blame the US and British invasion when you also believe that the issue is internal?
Well, it's both things. I mean,
how do you weigh it? You said it's both. How do you weigh it? What is the biggest impact?
Well, I'll tell you why it's both. Because before the Americans got there, when Saddam Hussein was in power, you could happily go down into the high street of Baghdad and drink tea with Sunnis, Shias, Jews, Druze, Christians, everyone. Saddam Hussein wasn't interested. He was not a religious sectarian leader. He was a nationalist, a Ba'athist, and he had no interest in religion at the end of the day. And I mean, he did do his slaughtering of the Marsh Arabs in the south, who were mostly Shia, and of course he chemically bombed the Kurdistan. But those were for different reasons. It had nothing to do with the Sunni sectarian divide. So then when the Americans came along and they had that big battle in Fallujah, admittedly sparked by these Sunnis, they completely flattened the Sunnis, but not so much the Shias. And that started this sectarian divide, which Maliki then made worse by when he came into power, giving 80% of his government jobs to the Shia and not the Sunnis. You must get your brothers and sisters together. He should have said, okay, my Sunni brothers, I invite you into a parliament with us.
Yes. They have been invited into parliament. Can I?
Yes, of course, Mr. Lacy.
I mean, if I could possibly make a comment. I mean, when we say that the main reason, and I hate to hear people simply repeating what actually Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been repeating all along. And we've heard the Saudi foreign minister, which he represents the bastion of dictatorship in the region. And he basically, there is violently sectarian discrimination against the Shias in Saudi Arabia. They have absolutely no rights. And he has the nerve to accuse Iraq of discriminating against the Sunnis. That doesn't hold any water, because if we look at the facts on the ground, we had Al-Qa'ida in Iraq at 2004 when Maliki wasn't there. We had a prime minister who was a secular, that is Iyad Allawi, and he is currently the head of the he was the head of the Iraqi bloc. He's a Shia, but he's a secular, and he led a bloc which is made up entirely with the overwhelming majority of Sunnis. And yet we've seen Al-Qa'ida occupy, as you said, Fallujah. So they were there. It is the political system that they are against. It is democracy they are against. And that's what is actually the major existential threat that Saudi Arabia finds. People going to the ballot box, casting their ballots. There is peaceful transition of power. And after Allawi, we had Jafari. Again, nothing to do with Maliki. we still had a similar or even a higher rate of suicide attack taking place in Iraq, where the Sunnis were invited. And to talk and say that Sunnis are not invited to share power,
David?
I have to say that
Yes.
in
Yes.
Parliament, I mean,
I just
in
want to
terms
say
of
that,
the
come in
high-profile
there,
jobs,
let
we
me
have
in again.
a vice president, a deputy prime minister, a finance minister, and 8 more Sunni ministers. When we look at Basra, which is a Shia area, it doesn't have a single minister. So I
Yes.
don't see, for the life of me, how far can we go down the line of appeasing them when basically in the era of Saddam Hussein, and you mentioned Saddam Hussein, who was a brutal, ruthless dictator. I'm not blaming all the Sunnis, but they were the ones running the show. They were the ones calling the shots.
Yes.
David?
But let me just say, well, look, when you go back to looking at Saudi Arabia, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Look at the other side of the coin. Is in the place next to Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. In Bahrain, it's the opposite way round. The Sunni Khalifa family are in power. The massive Shia-dominated country full of the people, they are the ones who are being downtrodden. They are not included in that administration, just as the other way round.
Which is
Maliki
absolutely
doesn't
true.
include
You're
the
right.
Sunnis.
They are discriminated
Yeah, but what I'm
against, so they
trying to
have
say
no
is,
rights.
therefore, the only way
The
forward,
Shias.
the only way forward for Maliki is to talk to the Sunnis and include them. But he can't. It's too late. He has to resign.
Why is it
now,
too late?
and we
Why
have
is
to-
it too late, David?
Because it's already done. He's already built up the hatred. He's already managed to alienate and get the hatred by, also taking and putting in prison so many Sunni people who've ever protested against him and so on. Since then,
this
so
is.
he's blown his.
This is just mere propaganda. This is mere propaganda that the Saudis have actually day in and day out have talked about, which is absolutely unfounded. When you talk about Article 4, that is the main contentious point. The Sunnis, that is only the politicians, say we've been targeted with Article 4, which deals with terrorism. Now, let's basically not forget, in 2008, it was Maliki who led his forces to actually go into Basra and tackle the militias who happen to be all Shias head on and apply the Article 4 down to the letter, and we had the strictest implementation, followed by Imara, which is a Shia area, followed by Al-Sadr city. So to say that Article 4 has been targeting unfairly the Sunnis doesn't hold any water. I mean, now we can say that because they were running the show, no matter what jobs you give them, no matter how highly influential, they are not going to accept them because they find them highly inadequate in comparison to actually wielding power in Iraq, and they were the ones that they were running the show. And we have another problem. The leaders of the Sunni population, like Osama Najafi, now you're saying and admitting that the Shias are the majority in Iraq. He actually disputes that and says we are the Sunnis, we are the majority. So that is one main source of the confrontation.
We'll get back to this. Chris, do you think that it justifies what David just said via Skype? Do you think it's justified that Maliki should step down just because he did not really succeed in including the Sunni factions in Iraq? But not all the Sunnis are in the ISIS.
It's a very difficult question as well. I think Maliki needs to step down because he has lost the support of many of the people. And unless you have tried to create a national entity of Iraq, you've got to have the support of 40, 50, 60% of the people. And Maliki hasn't got that. So I would say it's definitely time that he stood down.
David Lowley?
No, I just want to say, Chris, let me just put you right about something. The percentages are roughly fairly evenly split. It's about 48% Sunni and about 52%. So he does have 50% of the vote, Maliki. It's the Shia vote he does have. It's the fact that he does have no support from the Sunnis whatsoever.
But David,
there's a war and people getting killed, that he should now just put his hand up and say, okay, what I need is an Arab force to come in here, an Arab force, a peacekeeping force to come in here and sort this mess out, but not the Americans. They should be banned from going anywhere near the place. It must be an Arab peacekeeping force, and it must have both 50% and 50% Sunni and Shia. Until the Sunnis and Shias, Iran and Saudi Arabia, talk to each other, these wars will continue. And don't forget, they're run by the crooks, Al-Qa'ida, the murderers, and the guys who've been let out of jail who run these wars for the two sides in a proxy situation. You must have an Arab peacekeeping force there.
I agree with that.
That was David Lowley Wakeland, filmmaker of the Alternative Iraq Inquiry. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Chris, had the Iraqi army controlled the porous border with Syria, do you think this could have been avoided, the mess that is happening today in Iraq?
No, I don't think so. Again, I feel that the Iraqi army has been demoralized, basically. It's been paid to be there, and nobody really wants to act as a police force on your own population. And the whole issue of trying to use the Iraqi army to keep out so-called terrorist forces, when they see them as their compatriots, I think it's a very difficult area, and that's really why I think so many people have just given up, and they don't want to kill each other.
Zaid Alisa, there's a power vacuum in Baghdad because since the general election in April, Nouri al-Maliki has been unable to find coalition partners. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, I have to pick up on one point mentioned by David very quickly. He says that the country is nearly evenly divided, 52%, and the Sunnis and the Kurds 48%. This is totally untrue. It's unfounded. And if we refer to any foreign ministry report, then they would tell you that the minimum of the representation that the Shia have is 65%. That's according to foreign ministries of well-informed countries, and even according to the dictator Hosni Mubarak, who had no love lost for the Iraqis when he said Shias represent 65%. Now, going to the point that Maliki should step down, he was elected through democratic means. He had 95 seats, and 720,000 people voted for him in Iraq. And there is a precedent. This is not going to solve the problem. Some people do not remember that in 2006, the Iraqi National Alliance, which is the Shia bloc, were forced, because the Americans were there, by pressure from the Kurds and also pressures from the Sunnis, to actually, they said, and they were adamant, that Ja'fari should not be the next prime minister. And the Iraqi alliance, the Shia bloc, relented and they gave way. And actually Maliki came as a replacement of Ja'fari. Now, the same story is repeating itself. Now we're not happy about Maliki. He should go. Why can't the Shia as a majority say, we're not happy about Barzani, the leader of the Kurdish region? He wasn't elected, by the way. I mean, he postponed the elections. He gave himself 2 years extra because he refused to go to the polls. So now he has absolutely no legitimacy, and we don't hear any voices in the West calling on Barzani. You are the president of the Kurdish region. You have overstepped your authority according to the Iraqi constitution. You are running a totally independent country. You are here in a major breach of the Iraqi constitution, flagrant violation of the Iraqi constitution. You are exporting oil through an agreement with Turkey and defying the central authority. You have your own army, which is the Peshmerga. But coming back to your question, I mean, if we look at what happened after the election, the state of the law, which is Maliki blocks, had 95 seats. The whole parliament consists of 328 seats. Maliki was well on his way to forming the largest bloc. All you need in Iraq to get to the number, the magical figure, which is 165, in order to form the government. We've seen him getting allies, and he moved to 119. There was an announcement which was imminent by some Sunni forces, which were called the Union of National Forces, Sunni bloc of 40, who basically removed the red line, saying if the National Alliance, which is the Shia bloc, agree on Maliki, then we have no preservations. We're joining, and we're going to form, by the way, not a national unity government that the Saudis have been demanding. And I don't know who on earth gives them the right to meddle in Iraq and dictates what happens in Iraq when they are the bastion of dictatorship, saying that it should be a national unity government. And so he was pressing ahead to forming the majority government. But now we have the attack on Mosul, which has derailed the entire process.
And Mr. Alisa, religious tensions between the Sunni minority and the Shiite majority are arguably the perfect breeding ground for militias such as ISIS, which destabilize specifically Sunni cities in Iraq. Now, how did Maliki miss the chance to appease Iraq's Sunni minority?
Well, I mean, I have to say that we can say that there has been concerted effort there, but you cannot actually deal with politicians who are connected to Saudi Arabia. If we take, for example, Tariq al-Hashimi, who has been handed down now 5 sentences for actually running death squads in Iraq. Yes. He has been received with a red carpet reception by the Saudi foreign minister, by the Qatari prime minister, by Erdogan himself, and they have been emboldening him, encouraging him, inspiring him to defy Iraq. We have politicians like that in Iraq who see their interests outside Iraq or in forming a regional...
Chris, do you believe that Mr. Maliki missed the chance to appease the Sunni minority in the country?
I don't know, quite honestly.
Is it too late to do so?
I don't think it's too late, but things have to happen differently. And one of the things that we've got to make sure happens is that we revert back to the rule of law. I've seen too much foreign interference into Iraq's affairs, and we've got to find ways of supporting Iraqis in creating a decent society for themselves, not interfered with by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, by America, by Britain. It's all these people trying to get a hand into the problem that is causing the problem. And we've got to somehow keep them out, keep all of them out.
We will get into foreign policy in the next section. The central government in Baghdad is still officially in control of all parts of the country, but the Sunni and Shia divide and the Kurds is already well advanced. That said, analysts argue there is a real danger that the way things are going in Iraq today are signs that the country could disintegrate. In Iraq, the interests of many countries in the region coincide. Regionally, Iraq, Iran, Syria and Lebanon's Hezbollah are considered the Shiite axis, while Turkey and Saudi Arabia are considered supporters of the Sunnis. But although the radical Islamists are the focus of attention, there are also Sunni tribes supporters of the ousted Ba'ath rule and former military to contend with. Internationally, the United Nations Security Council has convened. Russia, holding its current presidency, said the 15 members expressed unanimous support for the government and the people of Iraq. US President Barack Obama said that Washington is examining ways to help Iraqi authorities combat militant advances out of the north, including some short-term immediate things that need to be done militarily. France opts to respond to the concerns of the Sunnis and to outreach to the Kurds, and Britain considers the ISIS a direct threat. Chris, tell us a little bit more about Britain funding the ISIS in Syria before we move to Iraq.
Yes, I mean, what we've discovered is that under the Department for International Development, which is really supposed to be giving aid to third world countries, they have the biggest payment of all is going to Syria right at the moment. And in the documentation, they have said that they cannot name the humanitarian agencies for security purposes. Now, sending £100 million nearly to agencies that cannot be named for security purposes is so deliberate.
Here from the website of the UK government, exactly.
That's exactly it, and you'll see there the biggest payment of all is going to groups in Syria that can't be named because they are not official. This is funding of international terrorism by the British government, and it has been banned. It was banned by the United Nations Declaration on Principles of International Law in 1970, and we pay no attention whatsoever to the international law.
But as you said, they were not named. How can we assert that they are terrorist groups?
Mainly because of the language used by the British government. They can't name them because as soon as they do, they say quite specifically on the site there, it's outside of the UN agency's relief. So they are not official humanitarian agencies.
Undisclosed humanitarian
Undisclosed agencies. And it's a British way of using language to fund terrorism.
And Zaid Alisa, the Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press both reported that the US was already flying unmanned drones over Iraq for intelligence and surveillance purposes. Both outlets assume that boots on the ground is not an option. However, as an Iraqi, could US boots on the ground, particularly in this state of emergency, be a game changer?
Well, I mean, we can't talk about boots on the ground because the Americans have ruled it out. It's not going to happen. They have been there. They actually withdrew their forces. The matter of giving them immunity from prosecution is still there. They won't be on the ground unless that's given to them. And I don't think that the parliament is in any state now. I mean, the old parliament is gone now. We have a new parliament. We still haven't gone. The first session hasn't commenced, haven't started in the new parliament. So I do believe what the Iraqi officials, I mean, have asked for is simply air support. They haven't asked for boots on the ground. They do not want boots on the ground because that would create immense problems, and then we'll basically go back to describing Iraq as an occupied country, and that is something that gave immense pleasure to countries like Saudi Arabia, who described the Iraqi democracy as an occupier's democracy, and they are really frightened that any triumph to any democracy in the region would inspire the insatiable appetite of their own people who went out clamoring for reform and for democratic change and political reform. So I do believe that what's needed is simply airstrikes as specific targets that, by the way, the Americans have turned a blind eye, and that is even written in the New York Times, Washington Post. They fully knew that the Saudi arms were going to extremist groups, Al-Nusra and Al-Qa'ida, but they wanted at the time to actually hold the advance or forestall the advance of the Syrian army against what they call moderate elements like the so-called Free Syrian Army, and they actually gave the green light to the Saudis to use the terrorist organization, and that was between 2012 at the beginning till the end, when Al-Nusra Front wasn't declared a terrorist organization. So there was a window of opportunity to arm those terrorist groups that the Americans were happy with.
And now let's talk to Jim Brand of Stop the War Coalition. Thank you very much for being on Straightforward.
Hi, thank you.
Some argue that the ISIS is now coming to Iraq to attack a government allied with its twin enemies, namely the US and Iran. How accurate is this, that Iran and the US have the same enemies on this occasion, while in the case of Syria, the ISIS fighting President Assad's government was not seen as an enemy by the US?
No, I don't think it's a very good formulation to say that even in this situation that they have the same enemies. Because the United States, of course, the United States still has an interest in the region, not just an interest.
What are these interests?
Sorry?
What are these interests?
Well, I mean, the United States take on, if we call the region as a whole the Middle East, the United States interest for many decades now has been to be the dominant force.
Yes.
And I mean, for example, you go back 30 and more years, they operated mainly through what they called regional influentials. They picked countries that they said would be the countries to back to maintain their interest. Of course, there was Israel, but there was also in particular Saudi Arabia and, of course, at that time, the Shah's Iran. That all collapsed in 1979, and the United States moved from then to a much more forward policy of basing troops in the region and having a direct military influence. And of course that was accelerated in 1991 with the war then. And I mean, that hasn't changed. And it's worth pointing out that the first head of the occupation administration, before Paul Bremer, people will remember Paul Bremer, the one who lasted a month before that, before he was replaced, General J. Garner, he said that Iraq will be as the Philippines was for 100 years to the United States. The United States occupied the Philippines in 1898.
That's quite a statement.
He said it was our coaling station in the Pacific. That's how he described it. And he said specifically, Iraq will be our coaling station in the Middle East for years to come. Now, that clearly hasn't worked. But you can clearly say that you have a situation where the United States, in some ways, actually would find it quite advantageous, because the United States would intervene with its air power, which is the strength that it has. It doesn't want to get tangled on the ground. It would intervene, it would change the situation with its air power. It leaves an Iraq which, apart from anything else, is very weak in air power. So, that would be a specific United States interest within its overall strategy. And the fact that Iran is threatened by the situation in Iraq does not, in that sense, make them bedfellows.
Jim Brand, the Scotsman from the UK, features analysis on Iraq titled "West Far from Blameless for Iraq Chaos." It suggests that Iraq's dilemma was immediately caused by the war in Syria. To what extent could this be seen as an outspread of what is happening in Syria rather than an internal Iraqi predisposition that paved the way for it?
Clearly, there's a very close relationship. And I think one thing you have to look at is the fact that any grand plan that the West has had for the region, or specifically the United States has had for the region, has very largely gone out of the window. At one point, 10 years ago, they thought they could overthrow the government of Iraq, become the dominant power in Iraq, and Iraq would become an American base of operations. That's gone, so they're fishing all the time. And one aspect of it is that they thought, well, now is the time to get rid of the government of Syria. That's how they saw it 3 years ago. And that's failed. But it has created, once again, this blowback situation, which they create all the time, but far more so in recent years. An analogy, a good example of that is Libya. And in that sense, absolutely, they've created a situation where the same forces have a free hand on both sides of the
Jim,
border.
what's Stop the War coalition doing about this today? What are your thoughts there?
Apart from clearly calling for, we played a very major role in simply stopping Western intervention in Syria last year. It was very, very powerful. You get very few examples in history where putting pressure at exactly the right point produces a result, because there was tremendous doubt within British ruling circles about military intervention in Syria. And when we gathered outside the parliament for the votes, there was only a few hundred of us, but the media actually gave us very serious space, because that section of the establishment that saw reason needed a picture of us to threaten the other section with us, saying these people will come out in their thousands if you intervene. The result is the British Parliament voted against military intervention. British government actually explicitly said we will not intervene militarily, and that directly triggered the result in the United States. So that was a specific example in the case of Syria.
Stay with us, Jim. Let's talk to Mr. Chris Coverdale here about intervention as well. Back to President Obama, he said, quote, some short-term immediate things that need to be done militarily. In your opinion, why is President Obama prevaricating, or to say it in American terms, beating around the bush?
Yes, he is prevaricating. One of the important bits underlying it is that more and more people are realizing that bombing innocent people has no effect on the long-term political issues. And I think they understand now they cannot make an effective military intervention into the situation, and they are not really knowing what to do. And they've lost a bit of support certainly from Britain, and so they can't get a whole load of us back into there in a military way. So I personally think they've lost the initiative now.
And what do you think of Obama's stance, Jim?
I agree with Chris. He knows what he would like to do, but he just cannot find the proper opening in such a way as to seize control of the situation to the advantage of the United States and to regain positions. And that would be his central underlying ambition. And none of the options from that point of view are clear-cut for him.
Zaid, thank you very much, Jim Brand of Stop the War Coalition, for being on Straightforward. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. My pleasure.
Zaid Alisa, in Iraq, the US clearly has no problem helping a government that maintains a close relationship with Iran. That wasn't the case in Syria. How could we explain this, and what's the Iraqi variant that would justify the US stance so as opposed to Syria, who had the same ISIS fighting there?
Well, it's a completely different situation. If you go out and you bomb ISIS, and we are talking about bombing which is pinpoint accuracy bombing against those ISIS who are there on the ground, could be seen, they are basically terrorizing the people there on the ground, burning churches, killing soldiers, as we've seen, instigating and fomenting and pushing Iraq towards a fully fledged sectarian war, then you are simply backing up a democratically elected government. You are bolstering that government, and you cannot have it both ways. Deny the Iraqi army, which represents the state, which is a legitimate state, the means to defend itself, and tell us, no, we're not going to give you the air power, and at the same time basically refuse to adhere to an agreement, which is the strategic agreement between Iraq and America, and back up the Iraqi army, which is a legitimate government. If we look at Syria, on the other hand, the intention was simply punishing a legitimate government which had the support of the people, as we've seen in the election, people turning out and backing their own government in an election, bombing this very legitimate government in favor of what? In favor of what people now agree, that there are terrorist organizations, namely Al-Nusra Front, Al-Qa'ida also in Syria, and they are at the forefront spearheading the onslaught against a legitimate government. So you will be taking action on behalf and turning the states, America and the Western world, into an air force defending terrorist organizations, and there is no clear blue water between those terrorist organizations and what they call moderate elements or the Free Syrian Army. We've seen those groups actually changing sides, swapping allegiance to the highest bidder, and they are financed and backed by the bastion of dictatorship in the Arab world, which is Saudi Arabia.
Chris, let's move back now to the UK, where Prime Minister David Cameron said the ISIS is a direct threat to Britain. He said, quote, the UK exports more young men to become jihadis in Europe more than any other country in Europe. But when it comes to taking action in relation to this, he mentioned being, quote, intelligent in interventions that we make, unquote. Do you think the Prime Minister meant by intervention and internal control of traffic into and out of Iraq so as to protect UK soil, or did he mean intervention in Iraq?
Military intervention, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think since last year they have decided that military intervention is nothing they can get involved with. The British public are really against it now. But so in terms of the intervention he's talking about, I'm not quite clear. Certainly when you start to look at the financial figures and things, they are trying to manipulate the commercial situations, the support for different groups at different times, secretly, and quite honestly, what goes on in diplomatic circles, I don't know, and I'm not happy with it at all. Trying to intervene in another person's affairs, another country's affairs.
We will talk now to British politician David Sylvester. Welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you.
The Obama administration announced on Monday up to 275 US military troops will deploy in Iraq. Do you think the UK could join in as well to help fight the radical militants of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the ISIS?
Well, what is clear is that ISIS and their leader just have to be stopped. Whether this should be done by a combined Middle East force, by the UN, by NATO, or by US with or without UK is a matter of opinion. Since another condition is that it must be done very quickly, the US is likely to be the only power with sufficient forces at hand, and I understand, in fact, their air power has already been requested by the Iraqi government.
And could one argue that the withdrawal of US troops from Iraq under the Obama administration has somehow paved the way for the ISIS to flourish in the country?
Well, the withdrawal from Iraq was a shambles, of course, both on the military and the civil basis. Lack of adequate planning was the reason. However, the original boundary setters, UK and France, left the country in such a democratic state that only despots like Saddam could hold it together. Democracy, moreover, is most unlikely to work in a country cobbled together in clashing religions and races. With Saddam gone, the puppet Western democracy put in its place left a power vacuum made for the likes of ISIS to have a crack at.
That was David Sylvester, formerly UK Independence Party councillor. Thank you very much indeed for being on the show.
It's my pleasure.
And my last question, Zaid Alisa. In 2008, military action helped push back Sunni terrorist groups in Iraq. But at that time, the government briefly managed to win over the Sunni tribal militias to its side, with political concessions, of course. In your opinion, what's the way out of the crisis today? Not simply the quickest way out or the temporary way out. What's the best way out?
I mean, the best way out at the moment, we have a major crisis unfolding in Iraq. So it has to be, the ultimate priority has to be to stop the ISIS in its track and to backroll its influence and to liberate the areas that it has now occupied and to liberate those people who have fallen under the control of ISIS. That's the major priority. And then simply go about forming a new government, an inclusive government.
Headed by Maliki?
Well, I mean, if that is the democratic will of the Iraqi people, I think all other countries should respect that, because Maliki has come with 95 seats, as I said.
Yes.
He has the biggest bloc within the Iraqi parliament, and the Iraqi constitution stipulates directly that the leader of the biggest bloc is the man who will be given the opportunity to form the government. If he fails in doing that, then this responsibility goes to the second biggest bloc and will have a chance to form the government.
Before I wrap up, let me thank our guests who joined us today over Skype from London, anti-war activist David Lowley and Jim Brand, spokesperson of the Stop the War Coalition, British politician David Sylvester, and with me here at the studio, Zaid Alisa, British Iraqi Middle East expert, and Christopher Coverdale, British lawyer and anti-war campaigner. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.
As many insist, the solution for Iraq has to be political, not military, arguing that for the Shiites to govern a united Iraq, a leadership that accepts power sharing is needed. The question now is whether or not Nouri al-Maliki can be that leader, and most importantly, if he wants this legacy or not. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon on Straightforward, and bye for now.